Hello there. Welcome to episode 4 of the Important Stuff podcast. This is part 2 of a series on the 2025 federal election in Canada. I'm Robert McGilvery.
And I'm Fareed Khan.
And what are we discussing today, Fareed?
Well, we are obviously going to be focusing on a few issues related to the election, as well as the issue that has been all over the media, which is Donald Trump's tariffs and how they're affecting the economy and the world. The first issue that I would like to touch on is a very important one, and it's housing. Mark Carney recently made an announcement that the federal government is going to get back into building affordable housing like they did after World War II. He committed that the new initiative called Build Canada Homes would construct 500,000 homes per year for 10 years. And that is actually quite the ambitious um, policy. The cost uh, of the initiative would be on the order of $22 billion. Um, Now, of course, the question comes up, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Mark Carney or whether you're talking about Pierre Poilievre, who have both committed to also cutting taxes, is where's the money for this initiative going to come from? What do you think?
Well, one thing I thought right off is, they're going to have to fund this and they're going to put us more in debt, but I'm not really sure what the plan is in terms of do they sell these houses? Do they collect rent? I'm assuming it'll be low rent for low income families, in which case they will collect rent over the years coming back, but I'm not exactly sure all the details on that. I did find it interesting that Pierre Poilievre sort of shot it down by saying he's going to build, crappy little quick flats or whatever the words he used, and with no parking spaces. And I guess he blamed the liberals that they don't support vehicles and families having cars, which I thought was quite interesting. Um, but it'll be a challenge getting that money for sure. They might have to cut other programs.
Yeah, well, the specifics of the initiative, as it's on the Liberal Party website, says that they're going to spend 10 billion in low-cost financing and capital to affordable home builders. 4 billion will go towards long-term fixed-rate financing for affordable housing builders. 6 billion will go towards rapidly building deeply affordable housing, supportive housing, indigenous housing, and shelters. And the Build Canada Housing Initiative will direct 2 billion to new student and seniors housing in partnership with provinces and territories, and that they will immediately develop homelessness reduction targets with every provincial and territorial government to improve access to treatment and then encampment communities by across the country. Now, I actually am wholly supportive of this initiative. Um, Frankly, the fault of the affordable housing crisis cannot be laid at the feet of the federal government because housing is a provincial jurisdiction. They control planning, they control uh, the uh, the building codes and so forth, and it's because of provincial legislation that municipalities are able to approve or not approve building projects. And it seems that for more than a decade, like almost 20 to 25 years now, the vast majority of homes that are being built, they're not in the affordable category. They're certainly not rentals. They are ownership housing. And the vast majority of that housing has tended to be um, condominiums or
Yeah.
condominium style housing. And this new initiative will require a complete shift in the way that provincial governments address housing, because the vast majority of Canadians still don't own homes. I think the ownership rate is something around the 40% mark across the country. And so the vast majority of Canadians still rent. And so the question that I would ask if I was speaking to Mark Carney is how much of this housing initiative is going to be towards rentals, because that's where the I think the bigger crisis lies, because there has been very, very little rental housing built across the country over the last few decades, and what has been built has not been in the affordable category.
No, that makes a lot of sense to me as well. Um, I fully support as well. Like, I really think the government needs to knuckle down and start building tons of houses, and the best way to meet that requirement is bid houses, cheap but safe and as quick as possible. And interesting. I'm looking at my notes for NDP, and the 500,000 new homes was actually in their plan from the last several years. So I guess Liberals once again are taking a mark from the NDPs on how to proceed. But then again, if they get another minority government, it's good that they're already aligned with the NDP plan as well. I took a look at Poilievre's plan, and I didn't see him talk about too much recently, but he's still referring to his common sense plan, which doesn't make a is not a, doesn't have a lot of common sense in my opinion. But I'll just run through what he's talking about. He's talking about requiring big cities to complete 15% more homes per year on a condition of getting federal infrastructure money. And he's talking about giving building bonuses to city that exceed this 15% target based on housing completions. He's talking about requiring federally funded transit stations to be permitted for high density apartments around it. So he's actually putting requirements in around another requirement around funding. And then he's talking about selling off 15% of federal buildings and also federal land. So this raises all kinds of questions, like, well, questions and some ineffective policies, I think. For one, he's not really given a plan to actually build houses. He's basically putting it on, you know, provinces and cities to actually build those houses themselves. And if they don't meet his level, he's going to cut funding. And to me, it's like they're already under challenge in budget. And if they only build 5% instead of 15, he's going to cut their budget. So how's that going to help them build more houses? It makes no sense whatsoever. And then in terms of selling off federal buildings and thousands of acres of land, I got two comments on that. One of them is it's not easy to convert an office building into space, into housing space. And what I've heard, I mean, and it makes sense. An office building is a big, wide floor typically with just offices and no windows. You can't convert that easily into apartments for a number of reasons. I mean, one of the main ones being that it's not built for the infrastructure needed for apartments, and its design doesn't facilitate apartments with windows. You can't stick a bedroom in the middle of an office building with no windows. You need to have a certain number of windows for that space. So it makes it a real challenge. I've even heard it's easier to rip down buildings than it is to actually try to convert them, or cheaper to anyway, not easier. And then he's talking about selling off federal surplus land. That just scares me. Like, what land is he talking about? Is he talking about green spaces? Is he talking about other land? And who's going to benefit from that? Is it going to be someone, converting land or selling land that's right next to a developer, or somehow, like, I just see there's that raises all kinds of questions. As usual, his plans are broad and lack details. Um,
Was there any dollar amount attached to any of the initiatives that he announced?
I haven't seen him talk about any dollar amount. Like in the last video I saw, he just mentioned his common sense plan, and he talked about cutting. The only dollar he mentioned was cutting the developmental taxes, or cutting or the GST. I think it talked about reducing
GSP.
developmental taxes, which is the same thing the Liberals said. I think they talked about cutting the development taxes in half, or the costs in half. He talked a little bit around that, and he talked about no GST on houses under 1 million, which I didn't really like because he didn't really tag that to the wealth of the buyer or new buyers. I'd rather see no GST on first time buyers or buyers under 35 or something. Like, a well-off buyer buying a $900,000 house doesn't need that rebate as much as a new buyer who can barely afford a house. So that seems to be, canceling it for everyone seems to be helping the rich more than than just everyone.
Yeah, I actually worked in the housing sector in Toronto for a decade in the 90s.
Yeah.
And one of the big issues that was always there was development charges, which,
Yes.
but the thing is, development charges are not federal. As I mentioned earlier, housing is a provincial jurisdiction. And development charges were specifically levied so that that money could be used to put in the infrastructure that was needed
Infrastructure,
for
yeah.
developments. So if you're talking about cutting development charges, which aren't in the federal jurisdiction anyway, then where's the money going to come from to put in place the infrastructure that's needed to support those housing developments? Both Carney and Poiliev talked about eliminating the GST. I think Carney talked
Yeah,
about only eliminating the GST on first-time buyers, which I think is actually a sensible idea because first-time buyers are having the most difficulty getting into the market, because once you already have a home and you build up equity, then it's easier to move into another home from there.
exactly.
But
Yeah,
if you don't have that step up, then the ability of a first-time buyer to get into the housing market is far more challenging. The other thing that I remember from way back when I owned a home in Toronto was that the rule of thumb was that when you're looking at buying a home, the maximum you should spend is four times your household income. So, for example, if a couple makes $100,000, then they should be looking at not spending more than 400,000 total on a new home.
oh, okay.
Now, if you're living in places like in the Greater Toronto Area, Greater Vancouver, or for example, Calgary or certain other urban markets, I challenge people to find a decent home at $400,000 across the country. And these are numbers from back last year, but across the country, the average price of a home was approaching $500,000. And in markets like Toronto, and Vancouver, you had the average home price well over $1 million.
Yeah,
So I just wonder, how is someone who maybe is making, yes, sure, they're making a six-figure salary between a couple, maybe 150 or $160,000. And if you use that rule of thumb of not spending more than four times the income, how are they supposed to afford homes when homes are in the $1 million range on average? Like, what is their money going to buy them at at what they can afford?
yeah. No, that's certainly true. I mean, I think the median family income in Canada now is something like 63,000 or in the 60,000 range,
Approaching
and the
70,000.
average family hope. What's that?
It's approaching 70,000.
Yeah, it's approaching 70, and I saw a report that the average house price in Canada now is 770,000, which is
Exactly.
much higher than that requirement that there. So I don't think that I think that that 4 times number is long past, unfortunately, unless we'd have to do a lot of work to get back to that for sure.
Well, I mean, certainly, expanding the availability of housing is going to bring prices down. One of the things that Jagmeet Singh mentioned is banning the purchase of foreigners purchasing homes in Canada. And I mean, I understand why he would put that out there. I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, what do you think about that idea?
Well, there's a lot of ideas around that. You can ban foreign purchasers from home. You could ban investors from buying new homes or REITs or new condos. I guess the economic point of view on that is that if you start banning it, then you've got less investment and there's less incentive for builders to build these. So I think it can work as long as the government is committed to so if the government's committed to funding and building X number of houses, regardless of who's going to be investing in them, then it can work. You can meet that supply demand. But it can't work if you just leave it up to the market to actually build it. Let's say like Polyev wants, and then you do something like ban people from investing, or you make it put in disincentives for investing, then it wouldn't work. But I think from a sense that I mean, Poiliev's plan could work to the extent that he really makes it easy and cuts out red tape, which I think he wants to do. It makes it easier for the bill, but there's high risk with that. But it's not going to guarantee. It's going to increase it by a few percent or 10% or whatever. I think the liberal plan of just pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and just getting in there and committing it, like really work hard and put that agency in place and the money in place to build those houses, and then you build models where it makes it more as you go along. Hopefully it makes it more economically feasible, like you're collecting rent on them or you're funding it some way. um it'd be interesting to see the full plan if the liberals get elected this time again.
Well, my concern is that what the Liberals have announced is a lot of incentives for builders to build. However, let's say they managed to build those 500,000 homes. There is huge pent up demand, obviously, in
Yeah.
across the country of people wanting to buy homes but not being able to afford to buy homes. But after all this tax money has gone into building these homes, what's to prevent people from saying they're going to invest, they're going to buy homes as investments, and you get the same sort of situation as we have now, where you've got a lot of people who have invested in homes as a means of income, as opposed to as a place to live. I mean, shouldn't there be, I think, some sort of limits on who can and can't buy? Because if the intent of this program is to provide affordable housing to those who want to buy it to live in, then allowing investors to come in and buy, a lot of these homes, and there are a lot of investors out there, obviously. How is that going to end up helping the um, the people who want to, buy a home to live in? Like, how's that going to affect the affordability crisis that Canadians are facing?
I think there's lots of methods and stuff you can put in there. Like you could allow an investor to buy these homes if say a rent and they're going to rent it, if the renter has like a buy to own plan or something where they're making an investment in terms of sort of funding this. So I mean, there could be different requirements in there, or where investors would still be interested in because they're making a certain percentage that's guaranteed by the government or something like that, or guaranteed as a reasonable good investment, and they'll make a solid 5 or 6% every year, or maybe a bit more. And but ideally, I think you want to build these homes to target new buyers, and then you want to put in the infrastructure in place to allow them to get loans, even with low income in some cases. And then you have to deal with defaults and how you're going to deal with that. So I mean, there's going to have to be a whole new regime and infrastructure to deal with it. But I mean, those are the outliers. I think for 90% of the cases, you'll make more affordable homes for people that want them. They can get an entry level home, and that'll allow them to build up to a next level home. And it might actually create demand at the next level. So once someone has lived in one of these less expensive houses for 5 years and built up equity, they can then move up to a bigger home, and that will actually drive demand for more homes because people have built up equity. So I mean, I think it's a great plan, and I think I think it'll work, and they'll tweak it as they go along, of course. But I think
Well,
that's a good plan.
I believe that, like, if you're an individual, you own a home, and you decide you want to buy a home and investment, I can see, I don't think I'd have an issue with that. However, when you get corporations and real estate trusts and developers creating companies that will buy these homes and then rent them out at exorbitant rates, I'm not sure that is actually going to benefit broadly the issue of affordability, or address the issue of affordability broadly in the country.
Well, if
The,
they're buying these homes, I think the rent has to be controlled, right? So I
Well, I
don't
mean,
think they can just buy.
one of the things that Jagmeet Singh mentioned in his housing plan is that any funding for these homes would have rent controls on them at the national level, and I think that's an idea that's worth discussing. Even though housing is in the provincial jurisdiction, I think if provinces are being given money to invest in affordable housing, particularly in rental housing, then I think the issue of saying that, well, if we're going to give you this money, then you have to have serious rent controls so that
Mhm.
people are not priced out of their homes through rent evictions and so forth, because that's been one of the big issues that's been happening in various jurisdictions across the country, which is why we have such low affordability rates in the rental sector across the country.
Right.
So, um,
Okay.
anyway, I think this is one of the bigger policies that have been put out there, and it's certainly not just in terms of addressing a major issue, but also in the dollar terms that Mark Carney has put out there. I'm actually going to wait and see, because I think this is one of those things that the devil is going to be in the details, because it's not just about the Canadian government putting together this company that's going to go out and build homes. It also means working with provinces, working with municipalities, and also, the government or the Liberals have still committed to doing to implementing programs within the confines of climate change policy as well. If they're going to move forward with this, they don't want to also end up increasing the carbon footprint in doing these programs. So,
Yeah,
as I said, the devil will be in the details.
yeah. I fear it could be one of those things that they'll make a lot of promises and they certainly won't keep them, but they'll hopefully at least keep half of it or keep some of it. I think this is going to be a challenge to keep this one going for the full term of any
Well, I
party.
think if they don't move on this one quickly, I think that we will have riots in the streets
Yeah,
because
that's quite
things
possible.
because things are getting worse. And this moves us into the next topic that
Yeah,
we're going to discuss, and that's the issue of how Donald Trump's tariffs are affecting the economy, and not just in Canada, but globally. So just a bit of a history lesson for people who may not be aware of this. But back in the 1920s and 1930s, the U.S. launched a tariff war to try and protect industries in the US. There's something which people may have heard of, which is called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act. And it was a tariff policy that was developed by two members of Congress. And it basically put tariffs on more than 20,000 goods that were exported into the US. The result of these tariffs was that the nations that were affected imposed counter tariffs, and there were counter tariffs back and forth, which ultimately led to the Great Depression. And over the course of the start of these tariffs until 1932, it severely impacted the stock market, which was on a tear throughout the 20s. And between 1929, Black Monday and Black Tuesday, and 1932, the result of these tariffs was that the U.S. stock market lost 89% of the value of its value. And given that at the time the U.S. was, the biggest country in terms of GDP, the same way it is today, this led to the Great Depression. And of course, we know what happened after that. And the Great Depression, we look at it in terms of how it affected us here in Canada and the US, but it was something that affected the world. And right now, we have a president in the US who thinks that tariffs are great things. He went from the so-called Liberation Day announcement on April 2nd, imposing across the board tariffs um, on all trading partners, although Canada and Mexico were very conspicuously absent from the overall broad tariffs in that announcement. That doesn't mean we've gotten away with not being tariffed, because there are still tariffs on certain sectors. But on that day, there were broad tariffs, 34% on China, which is the US's third biggest trading partner. And then when China imposed counter tariffs, Donald Trump went and imposed an additional 50% tariff. And now I heard in the news today that China is going to impose an additional 80% tariff. So, I mean, how is this, going to benefit anybody? It's mutually assured destruction. And what the question that I would ask is, where is Congress in all of this? And why aren't they moving? Because they are the ones who have the authority to impose tariffs, and they've just basically left the field wide open to Donald Trump to do whatever he wants.
I mean, I think this is a little bit of a circus with Trump right now. There's definitely some back talks going on in the rooms here that we're not seeing or hearing about. I think Congress probably knows. Maybe they don't. I think some Congress might know a little bit more about what his long-term plan is. I've heard a few people talk on talk shows about, and Trump does truly believe in tariffs, but the fact that Congress is still supporting him is quite interesting. I think they probably think he's going to back off eventually, because I know. I mean, what I'm hearing is congressmen are taking a lot of heat in the U.S. now from all their constituents on this, and they're super unpopular with all these tariff and other issues going on. I mean, I think they put him in power. Even though we talked about putting tariffs in place, no one thought it would be to this extent and this crazy. And I don't think they thought he was going to target Canada and Mexico and talk about Greenland and all the other stuff. So I think there's a little bit of a disappointment now with some of them, but I think some of the congressmen think he's going to back off. Like, I think there's backroom talks, and even today, I think they said that he delayed a bunch of the tariffs by 90 days, I just read, within the last hour or so. But not the China one. The China one's still going ahead, and then, of course, China announced that increase you just mentioned. So, I don't know what's gonna happen here, whether he's gonna charge ahead with all these tariffs in all these countries and ruin and push them into a recession, or whether he's just still using it as a negotiation tool and he's gonna back off on most of them. I think it's more the latter than the former, because it's just too much of a circus to believe otherwise. But at the same time, I wouldn't be surprised if he just charges ahead like a bull in a china shop, as people like to say, and destroys the US and the world economy.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, here's another, like, just the insanity of that list of countries that were tariffed.
Yeah,
The highest tariffs that he put out that were imposed were on some of the poorest countries in the
yeah.
world. So Lesotho,
And the penguins.
and, oh yeah, and the island that's only populated by penguins, right?
Yeah.
Like, so for example, one country that I saw mentioned on the news was Lesotho, a country that's in southern Africa, and it's surrounded by South Africa.
Yes.
They're one of the poorest countries in Africa.
Yeah.
Now the thing is, their biggest exports are minerals and diamonds and gold, which are bought by the West and by the U.S. But the people of Lesotho have very little ability to buy goods made in the US, hence the trade deficit, right? Because the US is buying a lot more from Lesotho than the people of Lesotho are buying from the US. There's no way to square that circle, because
No.
uh,
Well, I think he also wants to use tariffs as revenue. He wants to cut taxes on the rich and his buddies, and he wants to use tariffs as revenue, which will get passed on to every consumer. And so, I mean, prices will go up for these items, and the average consumer will have to pay more for them. So I think
yeah.
that's his plan to a certain degree.
But the thing is, all of this is out there. All
Yeah,
of this is out there of what can potentially happen. There's decades and decades of research by and analysis by economists and academics showing the detrimental nature of tariffs. We've already seen some of that in Canada with Stellantis shuttering its plant in Windsor as a result of the tariffs, and several plants in the U.S. being shuttered because of the tariffs. And the car manufacturers are, they're, they've got the White House on speed dial trying to tell the president and his advisors, you've got to stop this, you've got to pause this, or you've got to change direction, otherwise you're going to crater the US economy.
yeah,
And what happened in the 1930s, Japan and China, or sorry, Japan and Nazi Germany were two countries that were severely hit by these tariffs, and they had some of the worst impacts of the Great Depression. And what did they do? They decided the way to expand their economy was territorial acquisition. So China or Germany invaded its neighboring countries, and Japan expanded into mainland Asia, and that eventually led to World War II. And one has to wonder, like, are the people who are sitting there silent, not just the ones within Trump's inner circle, but the ones outside sitting in Congress, the members of Congress and the senators, are they looking at this history and thinking, oh, are we heading in that direction, and what the potential could be? Or are they just basically blindly following, like, like a cult, following a cult leader, saying that, oh yeah, everything is going to be fine, like this is going to work, but all the research shows that it's not going to work.
yeah. I know. Like I think, I mean, maybe the thinking there is that, the billionaires will still be rich, or they'll still be rich, and they'll decimate the economy, and maybe they'll take advantage of that, just like they did in past things. They'll scoop up a lot of property and equity at a cheap, and it'll just end up and then they'll cut the tariffs in the next election, 5 years, 4 years from now, and the economy will recover fairly quickly, hopefully. Or it may take 10 years to recover, but they'll all come out a lot richer because they scooped up all this equity at bargain basement prices. I mean, Trump even said that yesterday. He said, or the day before, he said, great time to buy stocks and equities. And like, it's not the poor people of the world that are buying those stocks and equities at a low price. It's the wealthy, right? So
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, they're living in a fairyland if they think that things are going to suddenly get better. Like even now, I've seen analyses which say that even if the tariffs were suddenly reversed, things are not going to suddenly return to normal. The trust that had been built up over 80 years between the US and its partner nations has essentially been shattered. Canada, certainly Mark Carney has said the relationship between Canada and the US will never be the same again. And I've heard other politicians say we can never trust the US, even if a Democrat was in power, because we've seen what can happen on the whim of one person.
Yeah. People have short memories though. Politicians have short memories. I don't know. I think it could all change in a couple of years. I mean, people made all kinds of predictions over the markets and post COVID and all stuff, and a lot of them are wrong. You know, they've been calling for a recession for 4 years now since COVID, or shortly after COVID, and it never really hit. So we recovered from COVID extremely. At least the markets recovered from COVID, and the U.S. economy recovered really quickly, and so no one predicted that at all. Even the markets jumped back up when Trump announced today that he was going to extend the 90 days. Now, I think that's a temporary elation. I think,
Oh, but that turned out to be
yeah,
false because he there was it was a social media post that said
yeah,
that, and then when they went back to the White House to get a comment, there was a response that no, that's not true.
that wasn't the one that happened 2 days ago. They were talking about the one that happened like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
There was an announcement today where he said he was going to delay it by 90 days, and the markets
Oh,
all
really? Okay.
jumped by
All right.
8% today. So, or a good 5+%. So, and I think that was due to the announcement or rumor. I think, but this was a solid rumor that they were going to extend a lot of the tariffs by 90 days, or the implementation of the tariffs by 90 days. So,
Yeah, but
we'll
look at how
see
much
how that plays out. What's that?
I look at how much damage has been done already.
Well,
The
yeah, he has
US,
done damage regardless, because the fear is now doesn't matter what he says now, he could change his mind in a day or a week or something, which means that the markets are already reacting to that fear. So,
well, I
um,
mean the numbers that have been thrown about is that the U.S. stock markets lost over 6 trillion in value. I mean, think about that, 6 trillion. Canada's annual GDP is about 2.2 trillion U.S. and the markets lost 6 trillion. I mean that's a number you can't even imagine.
yeah, I know.
And globally it's far worse because
Well, the
uh,
markets were hyped anyway. Like that adjustment's going to come eventually anyway. The markets are way overvalued. It's like the Buffett index. What's it called? Is like 200% or something, which is the size of the market compared to the U.S. GDP. It's the market's really heated now. So I
well,
think
so basically a
that's,
lot of speculators out there
yeah,
trying
it's a
to.
lot of speculators and it's a lot of drives. So the next there's going to be a huge drop eventually of like 30-40%, I think, in the market, whether that happens or it's going to stay stable and go up very, very slowly for the next 2 or 3 years and until the real values catch up. Or, it could also happen that it could stay overvalued and go up slowly for the next 3 years. So,
Well,
um,
I'm glad you mentioned that number of 40% because
yeah,
just by comparison, Black Monday and Black Tuesday in 1929, the markets fell by 25%.
yeah,
That was the trigger that caused the Great Depression.
yeah.
So if you're saying that potentially markets could fall by 40%, I mean that's like Armageddon. That's economic Armageddon.
Well, it is, but I mean, that's what happened in was 2008. They dropped like, I don't know, 75% or something, didn't they, in like a week or two? It was a huge number in 2008. And it took like and 2000 wasn't as big of a one day or a short-term drop, but the 2000 drop after the dot-com boom, the market didn't recover for 13, 14 years. So I think we handled it better with economic policy. I think the depression was so bad because there wasn't as much wealth then. I mean, the world wasn't as well off, or the West wasn't as well off as they are now. And the economic policy, like the tariffs and other decisions, they dug in and they thought the market would correct itself, and they didn't try to correct it, which is what made the depression 10 times worse. If they applied today's economic policy, the depression, it would have been much less worse, right? So,
Yeah, but the difference between the 2007-8 economic crisis and
yeah,
today is that back then all the international bank the heads of the international banks, all the ministers of finance of the various countries actually work together to try and prevent economic catastrophe from happening. But today, with the US being a rogue player, and people have to realize that the US accounts for over 26% of the global GDP. So even if all the other nations tried to work together to counter any economic crisis, it can't be done without the participation of the U.S. And it seems like the U.S. under Donald Trump does not want to be a good player, and play in a team.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. Um, let's move on to another topic. Let's talk a little bit about taxes and what's going on there. Pierre Poilievre has announced a plan, his plan for a couple of things. One of them I want to talk about is the TFSA. He wants to add an additional 5,000 um, special TFSA that you can only invest in Canada, and some interesting facts around this, that less than 10% of Canadians, something like 8 or 9%, max their TFSA now. So that really wouldn't, so this is only going to help the top maybe 5% of Canadians that really need extra room or can use that extra room. So right off, this is something targeting the richest Canadians in Canada. And I think only something like 50% of Canadians have a TFSA at all, and just that few percentage of them actually exercise it. I mean, I'd rather see a solution where you put a wealth tax in place and you give $1,000 a year or $5,000 a year or some number, 2,000 to in the TFSA of every Canadian who makes under the medium income of, let's say, 60,000 or whatever. So I mean, I would rather see something like that that would really help out Canadians for the future rather than just putting in a TFSA to help the top 5%, which makes no sense. It's I don't know how he can honestly say he's out to help Canadians when he wants to put in something in place that's only going to help probably the top 5% of the richest Canadians. What
But
do you
isn't that
Yeah,
normal for conservatives? Because a
yeah,
lot of their policies tend to favor the wealthy and the elites.
for sure. But I just like to point it out.
Okay, good point. Good point. I think
and
one of the other things about investments is that politicians, regardless of party, put out these sorts of announcements. But I would love to know where their investments are. Now, Pierre Poilievre said that he's reshored all his foreign investments into Canadian companies and Canadian investments. But are the investments that he's put his own funds in, are those investments all investing in Canada? Like, it may be a Canadian company, but it might be investing in some company in the US. So how does that benefit the
I don't
Canadian
even, I
economy?
mean, to tell you the truth, I don't even like his idea of forcing Canadians to invest in Canada. Like, the American stock market has done way better than the Canadian stock market over the last 10 years. Why should people put in their retirement savings in stocks that aren't going to do as well? Um, Now that said, I do think there has to be investment in Canada, but I think it should be rather than just Canadians investing in any old company and not necessarily like we're really Canadians should be diversified. And like right now, and one commentator said that we already have too much invested in Canada. We should be diversified in terms of US, Canada, the world, Europe, Asia, particularly because Asia market's going to be taken off. So a smart Canadian and a smart advisor is going to recommend that Canadians have their investments all over the place. I mean, what we do need, I think, for investment in Canada is something like the CPP Institute that takes care of the CPP. They invest very little in Canada. Like, I think they need to do some big targeted investments in Canada, um, which they're not really mandated to do at all. Now, I don't think they should be forced for the same principle. I think they should be making the best investments for the Canada Pension Plan, but at the same time, they should have a certain percentage. I don't know, 5% of their investment, 3%, whatever it is, earmarked for development in Canada, and uh, and working on developing those businesses.
I would
But
actually go a step further. I
yeah,
think that um, any public retirement investment entity, so whether it's the CPP, the QPP,
yeah,
the teachers pension fund, the Alberta public sector employees fund. I think all these various funds should come together and institute a policy where 10%, I would say 10% of their investments are invested in the Canadian economy. I mean,
That's a great idea, yeah.
the CPP alone, I think it's approaching $1 trillion Canadian in terms of value.
I think it
I
was 6 or 700 billion last time I checked. It might be close to a trillion now, I don't know.
But like if you combine the value uh, or the funds that are held by all these public sector pension funds, then you are going to get well into above $1 trillion in terms of investment potential. Now, obviously, what they have to do is they have to do the best they can for the people that they're managing the funds for, the people who are the contributors. But given what we're facing right now, I think there needs to be a policy initiative at the federal and provincial levels that will say that at least 10% of these funds are invested in the Canadian economy, so that the people who benefit from the Canadian economy can also end up having a future, an economic future that is not dependent solely on trading with the U.S.
No, I think that's a great idea, but I think it should be focused on rather than just anything in the Canadian, they should really focused on, what's the word? New equity
Infrastructure.
funds. Basically new, not no, new, like, new venture capital. Like, one of the things I've heard is that the US does so well with new companies and IT, et cetera, because they have a massive venture capital investment back in all these companies. And yeah, 9 out of the 10 may fail, but 1 out of 10 becomes the next Uber or the next Microsoft or what have you. So that's where they should be putting their money, not just invest it in any company, or they're investing it in a company to support IT upgrades. So like I've heard that the information technology within our companies is really lagging, which really hurts their ability to, their profit margin and their ability to compete in the current climate. And so that investment really lacks in Canada. And those big pension funds have the money to support some really good research and some really good investments. And I think that's where they should put. And I love your idea of the different pension plans sort of working together to do that investment fund.
But aren't venture capital companies, by their very nature, investing in high risk ventures? Because um, you're
They
talking,
are. They
like
are. Yeah.
in terms of these pension funds, their main goal is to maximize return on investment for the the people who are receiving pension, the people who are investing into these funds. So wouldn't that be like a high risk venture for something that is funded through contribution, through employee contributions?
Yes and no. Like maybe there's something to be said for that. Like, I think Canada has to make a decision on how we're going to be successful in the world, and I think we have to have something in like these new areas, whether it's AI or whether it's manufacturing some sort of expensive hardware. Um, like it's hard to get in the manufacturing world now because it's basically been taken over by the East and China. But um, are we just going to become a natural resources, or we could become a nuclear energy like we used to be, and we actually have some technology there, or more focus on flight. So I mean, investment venture capital, but solid ideas, and not all of them are going to succeed, but a lot of those are going to be the drivers for growth and economy in Canada. So sure, you can invest in a mine, and that will employ 5,000 people or whatever the number is, or mining, but you're not going to employ hundreds of thousands of people that way. I mean, you really need to drive the economy of the next generation and the future generations, and to do that, we need to be in the new technologies. And right now, the US is about the only one who's in these new technologies. It's like all these new companies, all these big companies are mostly US. and it's because of their venture capital and investment in new technologies. Like, I mean, look at the huge risks they probably invested into AI and open AI, and like hundreds of billions of dollars are investing in that. Like, that's what it takes to actually, you know, build something that's going to be world class. And unless Canada is willing to step up with billions, and it doesn't necessarily take that much all the time. I mean, much less can really champion a company, but you got to be willing to back it up. And if it makes sense, you still throw more money at it and not sort of back out when the political, pressure gets too hot. That's my
No,
two bits.
but how do you square that with commitments to lower taxes? On the one hand, we're talking about, um, the governments need to spend far more, but at every level of government, we've had politicians of all political stripes talking about reducing spending. You can't invest in these sorts of ventures without getting the money from somewhere. And where's that money going to come from? Because on the one hand, you're talking about, yeah, we're going to lower your taxes, we're going to make life more affordable for you. And on the other hand, you're saying, oh yeah, but we've got to go and spend billions of dollars if we want to have a viable Canadian economy
Yeah.
that's not dependent on trading with the US. I mean, this money can't be invested in things that are not going to create jobs in this country. And I think politicians
No, that's true.
are realizing that they have to put their money where their mouth is. And this comes up every election because the media asks about this, because every election politicians talk about, oh yeah, we're going to lower your taxes, we're going to cut your taxes, oh but we're also going to invest in healthcare, we're also going to invest in more defense spending, we're also going to invest in infrastructure. Well, you know what, that money doesn't come out of thin air, it has to come from somewhere. And
Yeah.
speaking of tax cuts, I love Pierre Poilievre's announcement that he's going to cut 15% on the lowest margins. Well, the lowest tax margin is actually 15%, and the 15% cut is actually just only 2.5% lower. So it's interesting how they play with this language. We're going to give
Yeah.
a big, huge tax cut when it all
Yeah.
actually comes down to measly amounts of money.
Yeah. That's an excellent point. And he also talked about I think cutting the capital gains tax as well. So there was a more things there, and did he talk about cutting it all together? I'm trying to remember what exactly he said on that. Um,
Did I hear correctly? I'm not sure if I'm correct in this, but I heard someone say they want to cut the GST as well.
I did not hear that. I only heard the GST being cut on new builds of houses and maybe
Okay.
some other stuff. I think they were going to cut GST on some other stuff as well, but I don't recall what it was. But
Yeah, GST on Canadian-made cars.
yeah, that might have been it. Or I heard it had something to do with Canadian made cars, but I don't know how they can identify that in Canada.
Well, especially
Um,
given how much input there is from parts that come from the US.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
Oh yeah, okay. He talked about cutting the capital gains on reinvesting in Canada. So if
okay.
you sell something and make capital gains on it, you could then reinvest it in Canada. So basically, you
You
can
won't
just buy
be taxed.
stocks, and then you won't have to pay capital gains. So you sell your business or you sell whatever, and you make millions or tens of millions. You reinvest that in stocks, in Canadian stocks. Then you don't have to pay capital gains on that. With the idea being that you eventually have to take it out and recognize that capital gains. So it's sort of deferred tax to a certain degree, and but it would give them more control over when they take it out, and so they wouldn't have to necessarily pay as much tax if they're reducing it. My
Yeah.
concern is that there's some loophole, so they don't pay tax when they sell their property, or they don't pay tax whatever, and they buy stocks or they whatever. And I'm trying to think, where's the loophole there? Now, if you transfer it out of Canada, or if you leave Canada, you have to transfer your assets out, and you actually pay like capital gains on realized capital gains if you leave Canada and take up residence somewhere else. Um, so you would no longer pay income tax on that, but you would pay capital gains on any tax. But my fear is there is if you're allowing someone to sell land and stocks and avoiding tax, my fear is they'll never pay that tax. They'll find another way to avoid it down the road.
Well, I think one of the things, and I think Pierre Poilievre made reference to this was relating to tax havens, and I think we talked about this in a previous podcast.
Yeah.
Where why do we have these tax havens? Because all it does is it allows rich Canadian individuals and corporations to basically sock their investments away in these tax havens without having to pay tax. Frankly, I think that tax havens should any tax haven treaties we have should be canceled, and all the unrealized taxes that are that companies have put into those tax havens should actually be brought home. Um,
I
the
mean,
part,
we didn't really need. I mean, TFSA is a nice idea, but it's really helping out the wealthy more than it's helping out the poor. I mean, like the RRSP is a great idea where you can invest in it, you get a tax break right away, and then you can churn it out and take it out at the speed you want to take out, and then pay taxes on it. So it allows you to get income tax free until you take it out, and that seems to me like a great system. It encourages saving for retirement and allows you to withdraw it at a rate that's beneficial to you to minimize your tax. But eventually, you do have to withdraw it. So, I mean, that seems like a reasonable model to me. Um, so, I don't think we really need that much more than that.
well, I'm sure that a lot of the details around these are going to be discussed as we get closer to the debate and um, people lock in their votes. I'm just looking here. I just looked it up, and it says that in 2023, 3.8 million Canadian tax filers contributed only to RRSPs, representing a significant portion of the total number of tax filers who contributed either to an RRSP or TFSA. Unfortunately, I can't find. I was looking for the number of Canadians who actually hold RRSPs, and I imagine that the vast majority of them tend to be older people because TFSAs came in what, like in the late 2000s under Harper.
It says I just did a quick Copilot check with the AI, and it says 69% of Canadians have RSPs.
Okay,
So
all right.
even that's not a full number. That's not enough.
Yeah, well, not only that, I have to
Yeah,
question, like, what are the amounts? Like, what are the averages of that of those investments? Because clearly, there are some who will have huge amounts invested in RSPs, and others who will, if you're younger and you're investing in RSPs, then you're not going to have a lot. So,
exactly.
while
Yeah,
while that may sound like a lot, is it actually in terms of the dollar figures that are involved?
yeah. I mean, even in that, I'm sure only 5% or 3% of the population actually maxed out their RSPs. I'm sure it's a very small number. Um, I made a pretty good living, and I never really maxed out my RSPs. Now maybe I had kids and etc. But I mean, and I did well. I was in top top quartile for sure and higher, and at least at the end of mid and end of my career, where other people would be much more challenged to put much in that at all. So
Yeah. Um, I think one of the things I want to talk about before we end this podcast is
yeah,
um, let's uh, let's look at the polling numbers. The polling numbers continue to show the Liberals in the lead. Some polls have shown the Mark Carney Liberals ahead of the Conservatives by 10%. One of the ones I saw yesterday that was on CTV said he had a 7% lead. Another said he had an 8% lead. Now, in the last election, the Liberals got fewer votes than the Conservatives, but they managed to get more seats because of the efficiency of their vote. This time around, the votes for the Conservatives seem to obviously are much higher because I think in 2021 the Conservative vote total was about 31%, oh sorry 33%, and now we're looking at 37, around 37% for
yeah,
the Conservatives. However, the seat projector says that they still may only get around the same amount of seats as they had in 2021. Whereas with the Liberals in they're polling in the 40s, they actually may get one of the largest Liberal caucuses to come out of any election ever for the Liberals. So it comes back to the issue of the inefficiency of our electoral system, which allows one party or the other to um, benefit immensely because of the efficiency of the vote, whereas another, for example, like the NDP, which is now
Yeah.
down in single digits, could potentially see them losing every seat. Even Jagmeet Singh's seat seems to be in play, which is really surprising.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. I heard an interview of a person that was voting out west saying um, they can't really. I don't know what riding they're in, but I think for some reason Green would probably have a better chance than NDP. But they were saying if they really want to vote NDP, but if they can't, if it's not, if the riding doesn't have really much NDP votes, they're going to vote Green because Green is the only other party that wants to have a new electoral proportional representation type system. So I mean, it's really unfortunate to see that. With this two-party system in Canada, it's hard to change, but, maybe, as the population becomes more informed and et cetera going forward, we might see change eventually, but we're certainly not there this election. I think if we get a new maybe I mean, all respect to Jagmeet Singh, who seems like a reasonable fellow. If we get some sort of more reasonable NDP leader in the future, it might swing enough for them to get in, and they wouldn't have to be in more than once to actually change the electoral system and permanently make Canada a much more democratic country, respecting the people's wishes.
Well, I know that that's where your heart lies, but I think the reality of the way things are going, and given the vested interest that both the Conservatives and Liberals have in maintaining the current system, I doubt we are going to see a change in the electoral system anytime soon.
I
Um,
Unfortunately, I do agree with that, but
Yeah, well, I think what I'm waiting to see is what happens after the debate, which is supposed to be next week, both the English and French debate from the debate commission, um, because that will really reveal to Canadians um, all the warts of everybody that is going to be on that stage. And it's basically around that time that people, just after the debate, that voters start to lock in their votes, their voting intentions. The other thing I want to mention is that while these polls are all well and good, they're meaningless unless the people who said they were going to vote that way actually show up to vote. Um, I think we look at what happened in the U.S. election, where Kamala Harris was at some points leading in the presidential race, but she lost big time because a lot of people decided that they didn't want to show up, or they voted for a third-party candidate. So while the Liberals may be sitting in the mid 40s and it looks good, I mean, to bank on that right now would be folly. And if I was talking to um, one of the inner circle, I'd say, look, that's all good and well, but unless you can turn that voter intention into a vote at the ballot box, it's all meaningless. Which is why I think a lot of politicians say the only poll that counts is the one on voting day.
yeah, that's true. Yeah. It will be interesting to see because there were some surprises in past elections for sure.
Yeah.
I don't think there's going to be a surprise this one though. I think the polls are going to be bang on for some reason because I think people have decided this is the one issue race, and that issue hasn't changed. And in fact, it's got worse, and it's probably not going to change in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So I think it's still going to be a one issue race, and that's going to be the decision. So, any last words before we wrap this one up?
Well, we're into the third week of the election, and while the polls are showing um, a race with the Liberals in the lead, um, it's not over till it's over.
This is true. Yeah. Still lots of room for Carney, who's the new fellow on the block, to do something to screw up their chances. But even though he's done well
Well,
so
it is
far,
the Liberals' race to lose unless they can hold it together and make sure there's no big gaps between now and election day.
yeah, 100%.
And of
Okay,
course, in the coming weeks, we'll also probably be seeing other policy announcements, which we'll get to in upcoming podcasts.
great. Okay, so folks, note that you can find our podcast on most podcast apps as well as yinsights.org. The music in this podcast is Trials by Bladen. Thanks for listening and hope to see you again in the next one.
Take care.
Bye.